Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to go through my slides today and talk to you a little bit about some Black history and Black future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Black global futures and digital inclusion. I always like to start by saying I hope everybody's taking really good care out there. There are lots of stressors, and of course, there's lots of anxiety, and we know the differential impact that this has had on particularly communities of African descent. So I really hope that, again, people are taking really good care of themselves, their loved ones, their colleagues. And again, I'm excited to be here. I work at NYU. NYU is a global institution. We have campuses all over the world. We have 2 portal campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai, and we have campuses in places like Madrid, Paris, Florence, and even in Ghana. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our work, our global work, and how we've been thinking about this work in relation to Black global futures. So when we think about the legacies and disparities, I know you all have talked a little bit about this today, but there's lots of disparities across lots of different areas. And we can think about these globally, whether this is access to resources, juridical and legal differentials, employment disparities, which relate to socioeconomic. And of course, we know about the incarceration rates globally. And then, of course, the intersectional disparities in terms of racism, sexism, and xenophobia. We know from massive amounts of research that what we are witnessing right now, particularly even with the COVID impact and the disproportionate impact on communities, particularly Black communities and other communities of color, we know that these things are not new. We've certainly seen this in the United States and also in Australia. If we think about Aboriginal communities and the cross between Black and Indigenous communities, and certainly across the United States, we've seen the level of COVID infection recently, and then, of course, other kinds of disparities as well. I just wanted to, of course, note, and I know that others have done this, of course, if we think about the idea and the reality of global apartheid and the way in which Black communities have been pushed to the bottom of a lot of societies globally, nationally, and we can think about that across the world, and certainly in terms of the ways in which in the depictions historically in the Western world of places like Africa or Haiti or even places like Brazil. And then we can think about, so one of the cartoons there talks about this idea of global apartheid, and then the cartoon at the bottom is really thinking and talking about colonialism and imperialism. And if we think of places like Jamaica and other places where we've seen that in terms of the movement of the West and westernized new forms of imperialism and colonization. We also have to think about the blatant image making. And here I have 2 cartoons of different images that took place at different historical moments. One is the Katrina, is referencing Katrina. That's at the very bottom of the slide. And as you can see, it describes on one side a young man looting, which means stealing. And then on the right-hand side, we have a couple who finds bread and soda. And we can see the depictions of them very differently in terms of the ways in which they are depicted in those kinds of images that are saturated, that we get saturated with globally. We can also think about the intersectional bias, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to bring this up. If we think about the relationship between age or gender, and particularly if we think about Black women globally, we know that they are disproportionately likely to be in poverty. And of course, if we think about the wealth gaps that I heard people talking about earlier, the wealth gaps are dramatic. And here in the United States, if we think about the wealth gap, we can think about $42,600 is the median wealth gap for single white women, and for women of color, it's $5 to $100. So that would be the kind of gap that we're talking about. Again, we know this is not new, and we also know that we're seeing if we think about digitization, and in particular, the way we've seen digital growth around the world, whether that has to do with phone use and or broadband usage, we also are aware that there's a great digital divide. And so if we think about the digital divide, this is a great impact in terms of elderly people. And we know that Black people who are in elderly populations, whether that's in the United States or Brazil or Haiti, we know that they do not have the kind of access that others do. And we know that age is a mitigating factor. We also know that socioeconomics, and on the left-hand side, you can see some of the information, of course, from the United States. And we know that 56% of low-income Americans have access to broadband at home, but we also know that they are using mobile phones often. And then we can see the global map there. This just gives us a better picture of that global map in terms of the differentials, in terms of thinking about the digital divide and inequities, and then thinking about the penetrations by region. We know that Black households have lower rates of broadband adoption, and we know that broadband adoption is needed, right, in terms of thinking about the movement to remote learning. The global costs are dramatic. If we think about $1 to $1.5 trillion in the wealth gap, if we think about the U.S. economy, in France, the GDP would jump to 1.5% over the next 20 years, with an economic bonus of $3.6 billion if we were to close the racial gaps. And in Brazil, we would see a $2.3 billion revenue generation, also if we were to close the racial gaps. Part of the problem that we have right now, and some people have heard me talk about this before, is that we have to think about framing, and framing matters. Often how we frame Black people is as a problem that we need to solve, or it's a patronage, and then we have to help out the poor people in quote unquote countries or in various places across the continent. And what I would like to suggest is that instead, what we need to rethink is how we're framing and then moving this into action steps. So how are we taking action steps individually or interpersonally, institutionally, and structurally to address these gap areas? And there are lots of best practices to do that. But what we also know, if we're going to think about digital inclusion, we need it to be affordable. We need it to have access to digital literacy and training, quality technical support, and that we need these applications to be designed and encourage self-sufficiency, participation, and collaboration. So if we think about places like Eritrea, where we're seeing young people take computer parts and rebuild them and reimagine them, then how do we accelerate that kind of work in places where they are accelerating new forms of digital equity and digital inclusion, and quite frankly, reimagining our access and computer kinds of work? And that will lead us to actually incorporate that hopefully into our organizational cultures, and then really to think about our interdependence, independence, and dependence upon, right, the Black future, and think about our direction, our alignment, and our commitment in these areas. How will we be aligned? How do we move from, right, a deficit or crisis-based model and a patronage model to an asset or strength model? And in that asset or strength model, the digital initiatives will be tied. We will see, right, Black people, Black and brown people as our assets and not our problems. And again, framing matters, right? And then we will have a focus on generations as an asset as well. And we will also be able to think about our organizations and transformation. I take this term from South Africa, a term of transformation in the post-apartheid moment, to think about how do we transform our organizations, transform leadership, and transform economic and wealth disparities. As Stacey Abrams has said out of the United States, our time is now. Our time is now politically, our time is now economically, and how do we shift these wealth gaps? We have to build Black wealth. And there are lots of ways, and I heard some other people talking about this earlier, but how do we keep wealth internal to our communities? One of the things that I'm excited about is the new work in terms of thinking about Black futures and particularly socioeconomic futures, the investment groups, if we think about Culture Shift Labs and other kinds of organizations that are looking at investment in Black companies, Black tech, and reimagining those spaces, and also collaboration. We know we've moved from industrial revolution to an information revolution to a collaboration revolution. We need more collaborations. I'm very excited by these projects if we think about Black Girls Code and think about sustainability and the next generations and building and imagining and creating a new possibilities. The Grandmother Project in Senegal, which teaches is about co-creation and allows older people to teach younger people about health and health care. Again, thinking about our future. And this is also focused on women. Think about if we had programs that we're having younger people teach older people around technology. There's a program in Arizona called Tenures. So how do we double down on that creation and that co-creation? Because that will lead us to multi-generational Black wealth and really, right, elevating those generations sometimes that are even older, right, and thinking about sustainability for the transfer of wealth across time. I'll end with 2 quotes, Zora Neale Hurston: if you're silent about the pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. So we need to speak up. We need to be clear about how we challenge economic structures and move toward Black health and digitization and digital inclusion. And then finally, the world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in. James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors. We can change the world together. I believe that. I know it because we are changing things all the time. And if we think about Black future, what we know is the Black past does not look like the present, and it will not look like the future that we have together. Thank you very much. And now, if I have time, I guess I can take a couple of questions.
Wow. Amazing as usual. Of course, social media is beaming and reacting. And I think for the interest of time, we'll take 2, if that's all right with you, Dr. Lisa Coleman.
Absolutely.
The first question that was asked here is like, how do we reframe the narrative around Black professionals, as you said, where we're not the problem, but we could be an opportunity?
Yes. So this is where I say in all of our diversity, equity, inclusion, transformation, and human rights work, what we need to do is literally that: educate our leaders that we are the opportunities. So if you're thinking about employee resource groups, things like that, how are you leveraging those groups and using them as an asset model? So literally thinking about trends in the future. If we think about emerging generations, how are you using your ERG that's looking at emerging generations, and particularly looking at those emerging generations in terms of Blackness, Latinx, et cetera, because we know that's the wave of the future. So really engaging your leadership and saying, these are our assets. And now let's leverage them and figure out in terms of co-creation, how do we create new initiatives and incubate together?
This is a question from Narila. She's asking, well, as a representative from NYU, can you talk about how we can educate ourselves and prepare for a better future for our young people?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. I love education. So let me say this. There's so many free resources, toolkits out there right now. And if you go to even our NYU website in the Office of Global Inclusion, we have a number of tools and references. There's just so much information out there. So please, my office is the Office of Global Inclusion at NYU. You can look us up. We have resources, toolkits on our website. There are lots of books out there. Some of the books that I will reference: Scott Page's book. Scott Page called The Diversity Bonus. Dolly Chug's book called The Hidden Work of Good People tells you about how to be goodish. And then the Scott Page work is really, really excellent, thinking about diversity bonuses and how to double down on that. So go out there, educate yourselves, read the books, access the resources. I cannot say it enough. And we can change our futures. Because again, right, if we think about where we were and where we are and where we've come, what we also know, and I didn't say this in my presentation, but the blackening and browning of our world is happening. We're seeing it in New Zealand, we're seeing it in the UK, and we're certainly seeing it in the US. So the future is ours, and we have a lot to do with it. Thank you so much, everyone. Take good care. I know my time is up. Reach out to me on LinkedIn if you would like to, and I will follow up with you as soon as possible. Christine, you're amazing. Thank you for inviting me back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lisa. As always, it's a pleasure to have you.